Welcome to the Language and Literacy Collective podcast, where we share tips and strategies to support language development and encourage a love of literacy in all children. This podcast is hosted by two sisters who share a passion for all things language and literacy. I'm Liz, a speech therapist and behavior analyst.
And I'm Stephanie, a literacy specialist and former classroom teacher. Our goal is to make literacy inclusive and accessible to all by equipping parents and teachers with the tools necessary to best support their kiddos. Now let's get started with today's episode. Hey guys, welcome back to the Language and Literacy Collective podcast. We've gotten some really great feedback about our last episode where we shared the first 5 tips for encouraging a love of reading in your child, and can't wait to share the other 5 tips in our episode today.
Before we get started, let's recap our first 5 tips. On the last episode, we discussed the importance of 1. Reading aloud to your child, 2. Modeling a love of reading by being a reader yourself, 3. Treating books like gold, 4. Establishing reading routines, and 5. Making sure your child has access to tons of books.
We want to share one little tidbit before we jump into our next 5 tips. So, speaking of making sure your child has access to tons of books, we wanted to mention another suggestion, which is book rotation. Instead of having all your books out and accessible at all times, consider rotating your books. In other words, you can have a portion of books available to your child and some stored away, and then switch them out every few weeks or months. This makes the books feel new and fresh, and your child might be more excited to choose a book if he or she hasn't seen it in a while.
Okay, so this leads us into our 6th tip, which is offering choice. Offering choice is such a powerful strategy in order to motivate and engage your child in any activity and makes them feel like they have more ownership over their experiences. For some children, you can offer lots of choices, so you could say, pick a book from your bookshelf to read with mom tonight. Other children may benefit from a choice between 2 or 3. So for example, you could hold up the choices and say, do you want to read The Very Hungry Caterpillar or Circus Opposites tonight? This is also a good option for children who are not yet speaking, and they can choose the book by pointing or reaching.
One way I offered choice in my classroom was to have my students go book shopping in the classroom library for their weekly allotment of books. Students were assigned a day of the week to peruse the classroom library and fill their book baggies with 5 books for the week. Another experience I wanted to share with you and for you to think about as a parent or educator is to think about what books you are including in your child's choice. As a media specialist now, my students have more choice than ever before. I have tons of fiction and nonfiction books, craft books, origami books, cookbooks, graphic novels, and even books without words. Some of the books I have in the Media Center I may not deem educational or academic or specifically on a child's reading level, but what I do see is children absolutely stoked about books, dying to have these books in their hands, and even though their choice might not be a parent or educator's first choice for them to have, they're creating a positive association with reading and books.
I feel like this is such a good point, and we've actually had lots of discussions on this. So I remember growing up, you were more into craft books and workbooks. And I'm sure mom and dad were questioning how much educational value was in all of the Sweet Valley Twins books that I read, but I literally read hundreds of them.
Yeah, to add to that, I was absolutely the girl at the Scholastic Book Fair who bought all of the books with necklaces or any kind of trinket or stickers. And on the surface, it might not appear that those books have a lot of educational value, but really any literacy experience has value. For example, when you look at crafting books, those types of books highlight the importance of organizing ideas and sequencing directions, which is important for any child to learn. If your child is gravitating toward any books like this, instead of steering them away from it, consider embracing it because a lot of those books are the gateway to more valuable literacy experiences.
So what you're saying is that sometimes all it takes is a silly necklace to become a reader.
Yep, basically.
I think this does highlight that oftentimes it's best to follow your child's motivation and honor their choices. Okay, so our 7th tip is to make reading social. Making reading social may increase the motivation for your child to read and may also encourage your child to read more. It can also help children make connections with others over shared interests.
We have a few examples on how to make reading more social. Similar to a family game night, you could enact a family reading night. Some of you may be familiar with DEAR at school, which stands for Drop Everything and Read. You could also practice DEAR time at home, and it could be only 10 minutes, but for those 10 minutes, your whole family can sit down and share one story or be reading on their own. Another way to make reading social is to join your child's friends at the library or bookstore. You can encourage them to choose partner books, which will hopefully incentivize them to read if their best friends are reading too. You can encourage your child to join or start their own book club, and you can offer to host it at your house with their friends and throw in a few favorite snacks. I've been running book clubs this summer with both children and adults virtually, and one of my book clubs was similar age cousins who lived all over the country. They were so excited to meet with their cousins via Zoom for a facilitated book club for a few weeks this summer.
Our 8th tip is to extend reading beyond the text. This can be done before, during, and after reading. Think about ways that you can make the stories come to life. For example, if you're reading 10 Red Apples, schedule a trip to the local farm to go apple picking either before or after. After reading Frog and Toad, The Letter, send a letter to a loved one. I actually did this in a social skills group that I was running the other day. One of our sessions, we read Frog and Toad, The Letter, and then the next session, we spent creating letters and sharing our letters with everyone else in the group and sending them to loved ones after the session. I also like to think about how to incorporate multisensory experiences. For example, after reading If You Give a Moose a Muffin, bake some muffins and talk about the actions, textures, and smells involved in that experience. One thing I always did in my speech group lessons was provide some type of multisensory or interactive experience to my students while we were reading. We used a lot of manipulatives and toys to act out the story. For example, when we read a Matt and Molly story about flowers, I brought in some soil and flowers and a watering can, and we touched the dirt, smelled the flowers, and watered the flowers throughout the story. This can be helpful for children who may have language or comprehension delays to be more engaged and better access the story. You could also celebrate finishing a book or series of books by renting the movie, or vice versa. One of my friends is currently reading the Harry Potter series to her kids, and they are really interested in the stories because they've watched a few of the movies together.
Similar to your friend reading Harry Potter, the Babysitters Club has sparked many children to pick up and read the Babysitters Club books again, including myself. I have a book club with a student this summer who was considered a reluctant reader, and the last time we met, she told me she read beyond our allotted pages because she loves the books so much. Much of our conversation revolves around the similarities and differences in the book to the television series. That takes an understanding of both text and the ability to make connections and comparison, which is a very high-level comprehension skill.
There are also so many benefits of extending beyond the text from a language standpoint. So I mentioned the benefits in terms of comprehension, but this can also help with learning new vocabulary. The more repetition a child gets with new vocabulary and concepts, the more likely they are to retain that information. So, for example, another one of the activities that I do in speech group is read the story Maisie Makes Lemonade. And within that story, I tend to focus on the action words, so words like pouring, drinking, stirring. And after we read the story together, we then make lemonade. And so for a second time, they are hearing those action words, and that really just helps to solidify those vocabulary concepts.
Our second to last tip is to celebrate all reading successes. This might be one of the most important tips of the 10. I've done a lot of research on reading motivation and reading success, and I can't stress enough the importance of a child's positive self-competency. If a child feels good about their reading ability, they'll be more inclined to read. Compliment their book choices, acknowledge them spending time reading, compliment their ability to identify letters and words. There's no milestone too small to celebrate and use to build up your readers. I know there are kiddos who will struggle, and it is especially important to celebrate the small milestones with struggling readers.
Okay, so this brings us to our last tip, which is building a reading life. Or in other words, give your child the tools and accessories needed to support his or her reading lifestyle. This will also help increase reading motivation. Here are some ideas. Consider creating a space or nook for books in your home or in your child's room. You can also fill the space with fun things like stuffed animals or a cozy blanket or chair. Some other fun things to add to your reading nook could be a flashlight, magnifying glass, or even some holiday lights. Think about all of the little touches that you could add to make it feel comfortable and inviting, and consider involving your child in curating this special space with you.
Whew. Well, that was our 10 strategies. Let's quickly recap the strategies that we have covered. The first 5 were reading aloud to your child, modeling a love of reading by being a reader yourself, treating books like gold, establishing reading routines, and making sure your child has access to a ton of books.
The second 5 that we shared today were the importance of offering choice, making reading social, extending reading beyond the text, celebrating all successes, and building a reading life.
So, just to summarize, we have been talking about how to encourage a love of reading in your child. Hopefully, you noticed that none of our strategies touched on reading instruction. Instead, most of our strategies involved ways to build positive literacy experiences and increase reading motivation. Motivation is so essential in any type of learning. Once you have that foundation, you will have a much easier and more successful time building upon this foundation.
Thank you guys so much for joining us for our 4th episode of the Language and Literacy Collective podcast. If you've enjoyed listening along with us so far, please hit the subscribe button, and we would also love it if you could leave us a review and share our podcast with others.